A Gap in the Spectrum is Marilyn Duckworth's first novel, written in 1959 when she was 23 years old. It is a novel whose strange and quiet compulsiveness entitles it to a very long reading life. It was published by New Authors Limited, an imprint of Hutchinson's in London. It was republished in 1986 by Oxford University Press. The silent, brilliant whirlpool of imagination that this novel discovers makes it an outstanding addition to the New Authors list. A Gap in the Spectrum by Marilyn Duckworth, read by Sarah D.
Chapter 11. The hotel was in the Rue Molière, a small street not far from the Louvre. I arrived there at 10 o'clock in the morning and was relieved to find my room would be available right away. I followed Madame's fat son up the winding stairway with my cases. My room was a tiny attic one with dark red sacking curtains and bedspread. Another piece of sacking hung along the wall at the side of the bed. I peered behind it suspiciously after dropping my cases and was relieved to see only a rather dirty stretch of wallpaper. Sitting down on the bed, I gave a sigh of fatigue and contentment. I looked around me and wondered what Stephen's room was like. This one was the cheapest in the hotel, so his would no doubt be a little more luxurious. What could I do till he arrived, which would be about lunchtime? I began to unpack a few things and came across my writing case. Bother, I should write to Robert. Throwing it on the bed, I washed off the dust of travel, tried on my new frock, then took it off again. Lying on the bed in my slip, I took up my writing pad. "Darling Robert," I began, "something awful is happening. I think I'm falling out of love with you. Perhaps it should end here. Don't think I'll ever forget." Oh, damn, it was no use trying to write in his own style. I couldn't take it seriously. Tearing the page off, I threw it into the tin rubbish bin. I had been certain for some days now. I could never marry him. I had woken up one night in Venice from a dream in which he figured. It had left me feeling as if I knew him quite well. He was no longer just a photograph and a pile of letters. Thinking of him reminded me, quite clearly now, of long, complicated conversations, sitting somewhere in the cold dark, all the time longing to creep into bed and close my pricking eyes. Why hadn't I? What was it that had kept me from saying good night? What had I been waiting for? What was I trying to discover from these long, circuitous duologues? All that remained with me now was the feel of my bare feet in flat suede shoes, my stinging eyelids, and the devouring tiredness. I gave up trying to write and looked at my watch. Good heavens, 1 o'clock already. I slid quickly into my new frock, pulling the collar into an elegant position, and went to the door. I was halfway down the twisty stairs when I heard Stephen talking to Madame. I met him coming up. He stared at me. "You here already?" "Uh-huh. I decided not to spend the night in Rome." A silly smile kept taking hold of my lips. "You can stay here tonight, then?" "Yes, my room was free, luckily." "That's all right, then." He smiled. "That's very all right. Where's your room, anyway?" I pointed up the twisted staircase. "Right at the top." He gave an amused frown. "Oh, dear, I'm right here." He took out the key. "Come on in and help me unpack. You weren't going anywhere, were you?" "No, of course not. I'm a bit hungry, though. How about lunch?" "Haven't you had it?" "I have, I'm sorry. Still, we'll buy you a yard or two of bread. What would you like with it? Cheese? Sausage? I'll get it for you. Have a map." He pointed to a pile of travel pamphlets on the dresser and made for the door. When he had gone, I picked up a map of Paris and tried to focus my eyes on it. I found a small pulse beating in my temple prevented me from doing so, and gave up trying just as Stephen returned. "Marvellous stuff," he said, biting the end off the loaf and putting his feet up on the bed. I cut a couple of slices with his pocket knife and sandwiched the sausage. "What's the matter? Sit down. You know, I'd forgotten how quiet you were. You are much more talkative in your letters. Yes, that's a lot easier. I'm sure you've got a lot to talk about. What is it scares you? Nothing scares me. I'll talk soon, I expect. I just take a long time warming up. I blushed. Well, don't forget, I'm really quite a good listener too, although I talk so much. Yes. You believe me? Well, that's something. Do you mind if I eat some more of your bread? He bounced up. He seemed to be in a much gayer mood than I had ever known him, perhaps making up for my own shyness. I made an effort. What were you going to do today? Nothing much. Wait for you. What do you feel like doing? How about exploring Montmartre? Sounds lovely. All of Paris sounds lovely. My voice seemed to spill out, and Stephen looked up at me. I hope you'll think so at the end of the week. Coming back, tired from our long walk, we noticed a dimly lit restaurant which looked attractively romantic through the pale gold windows. Not too dear, Stephen studied the menu at the door. And there's a negress singing at 8. Shall we try it? Oh, yes, please. Let's go back first, though. I want to change. The negress didn't sing. We waited for her through mushroom omelette, ice cream and coffee, which we dragged out for as long as possible. At last we left reluctantly. The meal had cost us about £1 each, with tips. Well, we won't eat there again. Stephen took my arm. I'm awfully sorry. It wasn't much good, was it? The plates were nice anyway. Should have pocketed one. He stared me fiercely through the hotel doorway and didn't drop my arm until outside his door. What on earth will we do? It's only 9 o'clock. We should have bought a paper to see what's going on. Come in anyway. You don't think you shouldn't, do you? No, of course not. Do I look like a prude? A quiver went through me to hear myself talk like this. No, but I think you are one. He took off his coat and sprawled on the bed among his pamphlets of Paris. Come on up and help me make plans for tomorrow. He looked at me challengingly, and I sat gingerly on the bedspread. Are you interested in museums and things? He asked. Not terribly. We visited so many in the last 2 months. Of course you did. I forgot. Will your parents be on the boat now? He asked. No, tomorrow. I hope you don't wish you were going with them. I don't, I muttered with a vehemence that surprised me. Not pining to get home? No. What about Robert? What about him? I mean, don't you want to get back to him? I suppose so, but you see, I've been remembering things. I blushed. Things about him that I don't like. They didn't seem to matter before, but now they do. I don't suppose they'll matter when you see him again. I didn't reply, but looked down at a photo of the Eiffel Tower. What made you give up the night you intended to spend in Rome, anyway? Stephen picked up the photo, as if to see what it was in it that interested me. Oh, I shrugged. It was dark. I think I was afraid of being picked up by someone before I got to my hotel. It didn't make much difference anyway, because the train to Milan was full of soldiers. Getting amorous? Stephen suggested. Not really amorous. They were just animals. Stephen gave a burst of laughter. You're a funny girl. You must have been travelling a long time. 2 nights, was it? And 3 days. Diana. I looked up, startled, to see his head quite close to mine. Isn't it funny? That's the first time I've kissed you, he sighed. Not funny. My voice trembled a little. I usually get around to it much sooner. Oh, Di, why did you come here? I had to, on my way back to England, silly. But why did you stay? Because you were here, and you told me to. You knew it would be like this, didn't you? I suppose so. I meant it to be, because you're so sweet. Oh, Di, this is awful. I sat up. What's awful? Oh, God. I watched him striding round the room, sitting with my lips still parted. I thought he must be acting. A few minutes ago he had been quite sensible, and now all this. What's awful? I repeated. Oh, it's not awful for you. He turned round quickly. No. On the contrary, I was warm with an extraordinary new happiness. He stared at me. I can't make you out. I wish to God you'd talk. If I only knew... He strode across and put his hands on my shoulders. You know what I want to find out. I shook my head slowly. Several possibilities occurred to me. He wanted to know if I'd agree to making love, if I was still in love with Robert. Ask me, I said desperately. Can't, he said after a pause. Oh, Di. He moved his arms round me. Please. Stephen, I began, then broke off. Oh, I feel so queer. I'm going up to bed. Oh, God, I thought you were going to talk at last. He stood up suddenly. You're not going to be ill, are you? No, I don't think so. I smiled at him. He took my arm and escorted me absent-mindedly to my door. Chapter 12. After this, we began to treat each other, quite suddenly, with more familiarity. Yesterday had been Monday, and the shops had been shut. Now they were open, and I insisted on visiting some of the larger dress shops. Stephen was in a bad mood and kept suggesting cups of coffee, which he drank while scowling slightly. After lunch, we visited Notre Dame Cathedral and the Latin Quarter. It would be marvellous to live here for a while, wouldn't it? He brightened and quickened his step. Wait a minute, that bookshop. I hurried to keep up with him as he jerked me across the road. Blast the city traffic, if it would only go the right way. What amazes me, he said later, are all these little toddlers speaking perfect French, when I think of how long it took me. Oh, Stephen, you are silly. I laughed to see his low spirits deserting him. By the time we reached the hotel, however, we were silent and grumpy with fatigue. Stephen had bought more bread and sausage to save money, and we ate it in his room. We should be having a good meal of meat and vegetables, I reproached him. I'm not broke yet, you know. Don't you like this stuff? I could eat it forever. He snapped the bread in half. Yes, and a lot of good it would do you. Oh, you don't worry about that, surely? When we had cleared away the meal, Stephen plugged in his electric razor, so I began to repair my nails. Do you have to do your nails with that stuff? He turned round irritably. It stinks. Poof! Horrible. I screwed the cap on the bottle. I'll do it upstairs if you like, and walked out stiffly. No, wait, Di. His voice stopped as I rounded the first turn in the stair. It was dark, and I had difficulty finding the keyhole. There was no light in the passage. In my room, I uncapped the bottle and finished my nails with a few flicks of the brush. The red sacking moved at the window, and I rose to shut out the wind. Then I changed my mind and flapped my hands out of the window to dry the nails. It was quite chilly outside by now, and the lights of the street seemed a long way down. I drew my hands in and went to sit on the bed, frowning. There was a tap on the door, and Stephen came in with a folded newspaper. He stopped. What an odd little room. Suits you. What did you want? He crossed and took up my hands. Not wet? He kissed them. I'm sorry, Di. I don't know what's the matter with me. You must think I'm awful. I am awful. Oh, no, I smiled. I am. I wish you knew me better. I feel as if I've known you such a long time. I suppose I have, technically, since you were 6.5. No, you haven't, I burst out suddenly. What do you mean? A feeling of uneasiness came over me. I keep thinking you're imagining I'm someone else. All the time you're kissing me, like this. But who on earth? Oh, I don't know. It's just a feeling. Di, I'm only thinking of you. There's no one else I'd think of. You don't like being synthetic, he added. No, I said firmly. Well, neither do I. You don't confuse me with Robert when you shut those eyes. I don't like Robert. I bent my head quickly away from his face. What? I've been trying to tell him. But that's it. He looked incredulous. That's what? What I wanted you to tell me. He lifted my ringed finger and let it fall. Oh, Di, I'm so happy. He pressed close to me and ran his fingers through my hair. Diana. His voice sounded to be coming from a long way off. I want to be an animal. He said this with a note of laughter. Then, oh, darling, darling, help me not to. His body seemed to strain, then relaxed suddenly. You're looking so frightened. He stroked my arm. I was trembling quite violently. Mustn't frighten you. His own heart was beating noisily into mine. You wouldn't be an animal, not even in a cold way, would you? No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't dare. He laughed and said, Oh, darling, I think you're lovely. You're a very, very little girl, and fell asleep. I listened to his heavy breathing in surprise. My own was quick and frightened. Gradually it subsided, and I lay in a curious state of peace. I looked at the veins across his eyelids. He had been so theatrical. I almost couldn't believe it had happened, and yet it was so nice, lying here with him. It was warm and reassuring. I thought of how cold the room had seemed when I was in it alone. The folded newspaper lay at the back of Stephen's head, and I leant across to take it. He sat up. Oh, sorry. He grinned at me sleepily, then bent and kissed my ear before standing up. Yes, we're going out. He indicated the newspaper. Where to? It's nearly 8:30. It doesn't start till 9 or something. Comédie Française. L'annonce faite à Marie. Do you want to? Good idea. Go away then and let me change. You've crushed me to bits. I understood very little of the play. It was extremely hot in the theatre and grew hotter as the play progressed. We spent most of the first interval running down the many stairs for bottles of Coke, which were warm and frothy to our disappointment. The performance finished very late, and we arrived home absent-minded with weariness. Stephen slept late next morning, but at 7 I found myself impatiently wide awake. I lingered over dressing and went downstairs to peep round Stephen's door. He was lying on his stomach with his clothes on his feet. His trousers had slid off into a heap on the floor. So I crept in and folded them. I sat at his dressing table for half an hour, reading a copy of Vile Bodies, which he had left lying there, face up. When he still didn't wake, I wrote him a note and went out for a walk. The weather had unexpectedly turned cold, and there was a fierce wind blowing, so I had put on my coat and boots. Swinging along towards the Louvre, I felt contented and sure of myself. I crossed the Pont Neuf and continued along beside the river, counting the bridges off on my map and lingering at the bookstalls to finger the grubby volumes. At the Eiffel Tower, I crossed and paused to work out my way to the Étoile. Walking up the Champs-Élysées, I noticed with pleasure that the sidewalk cafes were open and doing business. In the Tuileries, children were playing noisily and bowling hoops among the trees. I bought coffee and a handful of licorice sweets at a busy little kiosk. It was moving round to midday by this time. I had walked farther than I had intended. Outside the Louvre, I broke into a trot. It was warmer now, but the wind was still quite cool, and I noticed my boots had been chafing at my ankles, leaving them red and raw. You might have waited for me. Stephen met me at the bottom of the stairs. He turned to go back up. I went too far, I explained breathlessly. Then I had to come back. Why not get a bus or something? I would have got the wrong one. Oh, Stephen, my ankles are sore as anything. You're a silly, he said as I pulled off my boots in his room. Have you got any Vaseline or anything? Yes, on the top of my dressing table. Would you like to get it, please? We stayed home for the rest of the afternoon. Stephen tried to solve a French crossword puzzle while I read his book, Vile Bodies. We were both comfortably tired and smiled across at each other at contented intervals. It was 2 nights later that I woke to find Stephen standing at the side of my bed. I managed to control a start and said, without lifting my head, What's the matter? I wanted to tell you something. What is it? I sat up and lifted my watch from the dresser. 12:10, he said quickly. Can I come in there with you? I laughed at him. No, but it's so damn cold out here, he persisted. I looked at his bare feet. Well, why not tell me quickly then? It might take a long time. Oh, all right. I turned down the covers and shuffled over against the wall. He followed and put his arm around me. I love you. I was silent. Then a laugh fluttered in my chest and flew out. What's funny? Nothing. You said it might take a long time. It could. What do you mean? He lifted his body on one elbow and looked down at me. Stephen, go away. You're frightening me. Is that all? He dropped back onto his shoulder. No, I mean, I don't understand. You've mixed me up. I was afraid he would go away. Well, just lie there a minute and get unmixed. I'll wait for you. We both lay silently for a while. Then he said hurriedly, Don't go to sleep. I couldn't if I tried, I smiled in the darkness. You're the most tantalizing female. I don't think you do it on purpose either. How did you feel when I said that just now, about loving you? Why should I tell you? It's me that loves you. You want someone to love you, don't you? I thought you wanted it an awful lot. Doesn't everyone? I suppose so, but you keep pretending not to. He stopped talking and began to kiss me again. I felt his hand at my pajama buttons. Moving away, I said jerkily, Go on talking, Stephen. Why? I'm frightened. Oh, darling, I love you. Don't you understand? I love you. Let me make you happy. Of course I understand. I'm just frightened. Is that all? Nothing else? So we made love, and the wind made noises behind the red sacking. We woke with the sun on our faces. Stephen smiled across at me and said in a low voice, I made love to you. Yes. Happy? Oh, yes. You're mine now, aren't you? Was I very difficult? I asked with curiosity. Not at all. His face clouded suddenly. I suppose you've done it before, I hurried to say. Kind of. How kind of? Never like this, because I love you. His face clouded again. With Robert, did you? No, never. Not with anyone. I almost added, I'm sure of it, because I was. Oh, darling, of course you didn't. You're lovely, lovely. You used to give me electric shocks when I touched you. Don't I now? I laughed at him. Yes, but not nearly so painful. Good heavens, we don't want the maid to find us here. I clasped my watch around my wrist. How are you going to get downstairs? Run like the devil. He fastened up his pajama jacket and made for the door. Don't go down a flight too many and land in the dining room. That reminds me, he put his head back in. We'll have a whopping breakfast out, shall we? No bread and cheese today. Definitely, no. I listened to his bare feet receding. Let's go back to the hotel, Stephen said as we left the cafe later. Why? There's nothing to do. I'd rather talk. Me too, but what about? About you not going back to New Zealand. Aren't I? Not in 4 months. Oh. Why? You don't want to? He asked as we reached his room. Of course not. What do you want to do? He grinned, pulling me to sit on the bed with him. Well, I'll get a job and stay in England, I suppose. You're not getting another live-in job, he said. Oh, why not? That's what I planned on. I want you to live with me. I stared at him. How do you mean? Well, we could get married. He looked towards me quickly. What do you think of the idea? No, I couldn't do that. No? He gave an embarrassed laugh. What's wrong? I mean, don't you want to? You would soon stop loving me. You don't know me very well. You'd get to know things about me and wish you hadn't married me, I mean. What could I get to know? There, you see, you're worried already. I'm not. He looked angry, then softened and leant towards me. I'm quite sure, Di, I'll never want to leave you. But you just don't want to marry me, is that it? Not marry, I looked frightened. Don't get angry, Stephen. All right, he kissed me. It was wonderful last night, wasn't it? I nodded. You're quite sure? Of course. Then let's work something out. We could get somewhere to live together, just pretend we were married, for a year or so. Try it out. He was speaking jerkily and frowning. Yes, I'd like that. Oh, darling, I'd look after you, make sure you didn't have a baby. We'd be happy, wouldn't we? Oh, yes. I raised my head. Stephen. Could I be having one now? You mean last night? Yes. Of course you could. Good heavens, you should know. Yes, I just hadn't thought of it. Would it be terrible? I'd have to marry you, wouldn't I? That's right, he grinned. Don't worry about it. Everything's so marvellous now. When I think in a couple of days it's back to those wretched standard twos. Oh, I just thought, what will Maureen say? I flushed at the memory of her prim bearing. Oh, don't mind Maureen. I've shocked her before, and she's harder than she looks. Kathleen, now, she'll be delighted.